Hey guys, welcome to part 6 of my Learning Python YouTube series. In this video we're going to be going over functions. So what are functions? Well, functions are essentially little bits of code that you can reuse. You can give them information, you can have them output information, and they essentially just allow you to sort of avoid having to copy and paste code where you need it over and over, and they allow you to perform simple calculations, just menial things that you would want to have in the event that you want to reuse it over and over. And you wouldn't want to have it in the bulk of your code, essentially. But we'll see how to use them. And you'll see why they're useful as we go through examples. So, actually, I'm just going to put my functions label up there, header thing, I don't know. And I'm going to create my beautiful comment of small amounts of information, very small. Anyways, let's get into this. So a function is a segment of reusable code. Reusable. Did I spell that right? Usable. There we go. Code. I don't know if I spelled that right or wrong, but that looks right. Anyways, so how do we write a function now? Now we know that we can create reusable code. How do we actually do it? Well, let me show you the syntax just generally, and I'll put it in this comment so I can sort of write some pseudocode. So we start off with def, and you can think of that as define. You're essentially telling Python, hey, I'm going to define a new function, and that's essentially just what that means. So after def, you hit space and you'll put in your function name. Now your function name could be anything. I mean, there are a couple limitations to it, but for the most part, it can't start with numbers. And I believe it can only have numbers, letters, and underscores. I believe you can't have any other symbols, but that's the gist of the function name. But we're just going to say, I don't know, function name, just like that, right? And essentially that will come in handy when we want to call the function later. I will show you how to do that later in the video, but just let that sort of simmer in your mind for now. Next, we're going to have parentheses or brackets, and these are going to hold our function arguments or parameters. So what are arguments and parameters? They're essentially values that you give the function to use. So let's say your function adds two numbers together. You might want your function to take in the first number and the second number, right? That maybe user input could specify. And then once you have that first number and second number stored inside of your function parameters, then within your function, you can add those two numbers together and spit it out back to the user. So very handy. And you'll essentially just put them within the parentheses separated by commas. So for example, you'd have like arg1, arg2, whatever, just etc. or ... whatever's easier to read. But you can have as many as you want, and they all just allow for you to pass information into the function specifically for it to be used. Not to say that the function can't get information other than the parameters, but this would be sort of the main way of feeding your function code, or information, I should say. All right, so let's finish that off with a colon, and that colon essentially states that we are done with the function header. So all this up here, this whole first line is called the function header. It essentially just tells you what the function's called, what information it's given, right? Very important. Then within that, you're just going to say, run your code. Do whatever you want within the function. And as you can see, run code has been indented. So the code that is inside of the function must be indented by 1 relative to where def is. So for example, if run code was in here, this would throw an error because you have an empty function. There's nothing inside of it, right? However, if you indent it, like I had earlier, it would say, okay, there's something inside the function. That's what my function is going to do. All right, so let's get into a couple of examples. We'll create some fairly simplistic functions, and I'm just going to sort of create different situations and then explain them as we go along. All right, actually, I'll even write down the situations. So example 1. All right, so in this example, I'm going to show you how to actually write your first function. It's going to be very basic, and then I'm going to show you how to call it. So I mentioned how to call it earlier. I didn't really explain what it is. Calling the function is essentially getting it to run the code, like running the function or getting it to do what it's meant to do. You'll see what I mean. So we're going to say def, define, whatever you want to call it, and we're going to create our function. So this function, we'll just call it function. I don't know, doesn't really matter. We're not going to give it any parameters, so we're going to leave the parentheses empty, and we have our colon. So remember, it has to follow along with this sort of syntax. So def function name, so in this case our function name is just function. We pass in any parameters that we want to give it. In this case, we're giving it none, right? So we leave the parentheses empty, and then we have the colon there to say we're done with the function header. All right, so inside of this function, all we're going to do is we're going to say print hello world. Pretty straightforward. And that's it. That's essentially our entire function. As you can see here, it fits along perfectly with the syntax. Again, we have our define, function name, the parameters, the colon, and then we have the code that we want to run, right? Which would just be printing out hello world. Now, how do we actually call this function? Well, it's very straightforward. All you have to do is write the function name and then put the parameters that you want to pass in inside of the parentheses. So in this case, we have no parameters, so we just leave the parentheses empty. And that's it. Function name, parameters, and that's it. Save and run the code. And as you can see, it says hello world. Perfect. So we've officially made our very first function in Python. Granted, it's very basic, but you know, you can work with it later on. All right, example 2. So I'm going to be explaining parameters just a little bit more. We'll go a bit more in depth, and I'll show you a couple cool things that you can do with it. So what is a parameter, and how do we use them properly? So let's define a new function. Let's actually just call it new function. Why did I capitalize that? New function. And oh, by the way, if you're wondering why I'm calling my functions and stuff the way I am now, there's two different ways of writing your variable names or your function names. One is called camel case and one is called snake case. So camel case is essentially like this, like camel case, and you have the capital letter on it at the start of every new word, except the very first word. And you can think of it as like a camel's hump, right? So that's camel case, and snake case is essentially all lowercase and the words are separated by underscores. So I prefer snake case, doesn't make a difference, they're just variable names, but just be consistent just because it's nicer to look at, easier to read. But yeah, that's why. All right, so back into this. I should not have put the quotations in there, but we're going to take our new function and we're going to pass in one parameter, and we're going to say, we're going to call it output. I don't know, doesn't really matter. And we'll put our colon, and we're just going to have our function print output. So if we call our function new function, we can now specify what output is going to be. All right, so in this case, I'm going to make output a string. So this is a test. What I have done here is for my argument output, I am going to give it this string value. So essentially what the function does when it reads this is it says, okay, the function takes in one parameter and it was given one piece of information, right? So output must be equal to this piece of information, since they're both, the first parameter is going to be equal to the very first piece of input information, right? So this line up here, when it's processed, it's saying, okay, take in the information and the first one will be equal to output. And since we have no other parameters, don't take in anything else and throw an error if we do. So now output is going to be equal to this string here. And then when we print output, you can imagine it would print out, this is a test. So let's save and run. As you can see, this is a test. And again, hello world, for those of you who are confused, is from our previous function up here, from example 1. All right. Now, there are ways that you can call functions without specifying values by using things like default values. I can show you how to do that. So for example, let's say I don't know if I'm going to be given something to input to this function or to pass into this function. And just in case nothing is passed in, I want the function to say, I don't know, maybe no data or something, or no output value. I don't know, we'll just create a string. We'll say the default value, because this is how you define a default value. You just say equals, and then you set it equal to the default value. We'll just set it to the string default value. So watch this. So if we say this is a test, it should overwrite output as this is a test. But if we say new function and we don't overwrite output, then output is just going to be equal to this. All right, so think of it this way. When the function is created, it creates a variable output, a parameter output, and sets it equal to this default value. Then it checks if you passed in any information. If you passed in information, it sets it to the according parameter. So in this case, the highlighted case here, we passed in a string and we overwrote the output variable from default value to this is a test. But in this case here, we didn't pass in anything. So output just stays as default value. And if we save it and run it, this is a test. So the second line here is from this function call here, and default value is from this function call here on line 23. And as you can see, line 23, we didn't tell the function to change what output is equal to, so it prints out the default value. All right, so that's how you can sort of, error-proof yourself, or not error-proof, but protect yourself from errors in the event that some information may not be passed into the function. So just something to think about. All right, another example. Okay, so I'm going to go over a keyword that is very important when dealing with functions, and that is the return keyword. So you can think of this, actually here, I'll create a function. So I guess I use the add example. I guess it doesn't matter. So we'll say def add, and we'll take in two numbers, num1 and num2. All right, what we're going to do is, instead of just printing out the number, we're going to return num1 plus num2. All right, so let me explain. So for example, when you set a variable to the value 4, that value 4 represents the value 4 in actuality, right? But what if we want to have a function represent a value, like in actuality, that we can set equal to? For example, this function here, if I were to say add 1, 2, it would work. It would run the code, and it would add 1 and 2 and return 1 plus 2, but since it's not being printed out or anything, it won't actually do anything. Like if we run this, it doesn't give us an error, but it doesn't print anything out, so we don't know what actually happened here, right? But since the value of this function, like you can think of this as a variable that you can pass parameters into. If you guys have taken a math course, for example, if you know functions, with respect to x, or even multivariable functions, f of x, y, things like that, you're essentially creating a function where when you pass in values, it'll spit out an answer relative to those values, right? Or in accordance with those values. So what I can say here is I could say something like value is equal to add 1 plus 2, and then I could say print value, right? So if I run this, then we can see here. So what happened here? We have a 3. So we declared our function add num1 and num2, and we returned num1 plus num2. All right, so then what we did is we created a new variable value and set it equal to the return value of add 1 plus 2. So again, let's think that through. So value is equal to add 1 plus 2. So we're calling this function here, right here. Okay, so 1 is going to be equal to num1 and 2 is going to be equal to num2. Then right here, it adds them together, so 1 plus 2 is 3, and then returns the value. So it's returning the value 3, aka this function, when 1 and 2 are passed in, is equal to 3. Now I could change this. I could say 3 and 2. Let's close this actually real quick and run it, and it's equal to 5. So the value of the function changed based on the input, right? It's very similar to the example 2, for example, if I said, instead of this is a test, if I said, hello, my name is Lucas, and I ran it, it says here, hello, my name is Lucas, right? It responds to the information that was passed in, except in that case, we were simply printing output, right? In this case, we are returning the output. So new function, here, I'll close this again, new function, this function is not equal to the output variable here. But if I returned the output variable, then when I pass in the string, it would actually spit that string back out. So in this case, when I pass in two numbers, it spits out their sum. And I can use that by setting it to a variable and printing that variable. Or, better yet, well, not so much better, but I can just print it out just like that. Does the exact same thing. You still see 5, right? Because I'm essentially printing whatever this equates to, and that just so happens to equate to 5, right? So a bit of an interesting concept, a little bit different from printing, but get used to it. Mess around with it, see what variables, or see what numbers or strings or what you can get to come out when you run your function, your own functions, and just get to understand the return function because it's very important. One last thing I need to say about the return function, or the return keyword, is that when a return line is hit, so in this case, a return line would be a line that starts with return. When a return line is hit within a function, it runs that line and then it exits the function entirely. So here, I'll give you an example. So I can say if num1 plus num2, let's put that in brackets, and then we'll say modulo 2 is equal to 0. All right, let me clean this up a little bit. So essentially what I'm going to do is if the sum of the two numbers divided by 2 is 0, aka if the remainder, not divided by 2, if the remainder of the sum when divided by 2 is equal to 0, aka if the sum of the two numbers is an even number, then I could say return even, not event, even. And you might be thinking, okay, well then else return odd, right? But think about what I said, right? Return statements, when they are hit, they exit the function entirely. So if this if statement runs, this return statement will be hit. Therefore, it's not going to check anything else anyways. So I wouldn't need to have an else statement. I could simply just put return odd. All right. So now what I can do is I can say, actually I can just leave this here. So let's think of two numbers. Let's say 1, 1, and 1. I don't know. So 1 plus 1 is 2. So we're expecting the sum to be equal to 2. And then when 2 is divided by 2, its remainder is 0, right? Because it's 1 remainder 0, aka 2 is an even number. So it should return even, and it should print it out since we are printing out. Actually, I'm going to just do this here. Let's say value again is equal to add 1, 1, just for clarity's sake. So value is going to be equal to even or odd depending on the input here, and then we're going to print it out. So let's run it. Even. And that's what we were expecting, right? Because 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 is an even number, so it says even. Now, as you can see, it didn't return odd, right? Because it makes sense. It can't return one thing and then return another. A function can only be equal to one thing, right? Now, let's change it up a little bit just so we understand it fully. So 1 plus 2. 1 plus 2 is 3. 3 is an odd number, which means this if statement should not be true, which means this return statement should not run, and this return statement should run. All right, let's run our code. And as you can see, we get odd. So it's working perfectly fine. So just understand the fact that return statements, they exit the function entirely, and that they represent the value of the function given those set parameters. All right? So I'm going to go over one last sort of topic related to functions, and that is global and local variables. So if I were to define a variable, I don't know, let's say list is equal to 1, 2, 3. Actually, let's give myself a bit more space. Okay, I can't save it, or it'll delete all these lines. But let's say I have list is equal to 1, 2, 3. The function can access, so if I were to define a function, if I say def, I don't know, print list, we don't need to give it any parameters or anything. If I were to say inside of print list, print lst, my list lst, I'm just going to refer to it as list, the function will recognize that there is a variable list and print it out. So if I call this print list, all my lines disappeared again, whatever. But as you can see, it'll print out 1, 2, 3, right? However, what if I were to define a new list inside of the function? For example, if I were to say list 2 is equal to 4, 5, 6. Actually, let's change this to create list. All right, so we have our first list up here is equal to 1, 2, 3. And then inside our function, we're going to create a new variable, list2, which is equal to 4, 5, 6. Okay? Now, if I were to say create list, right, then you would think, okay, it creates the list 4, 5, 6, and then I could do print list and print list 2, right? And that would print out the list 1, 2, 3 and the list 4, 5, 6 accordingly. Well, let's run it and take a look. Perfect. We have an error. And essentially what that error is saying is that there is no variable list2. But that doesn't make any sense because we just declared it inside of this function. And that's the difference between a global and a local variable. So a global variable is a variable that can be used anywhere, hence the term a global variable, all over the globe type thing. A local variable is a variable that exists locally, aka only inside of this function. All right, so inside of this function, I could say print list2. All right, this create list doesn't actually do anything, and this wouldn't work here. So what I could do here is when I run this code, actually, I guess create list would do something now. So when I run this code, actually I'm going to put it at the end as well. So when I run this code, we're going to print out the variable list, which is equal to 1, 2, 3, and then we are going to run this function create list, which is going to define a new variable list2 equal to the list 4, 5, 6, and then print it out. So this should print out two lists. And as you can see here, we get the list 1, 2, 3 and the list 4, 5, 6. And again, list 2, aka the list 4, 5, 6 here, is a local variable. So I cannot access it anywhere outside of the function. I could return that list and then I could use it outside of the function because I could say something like, I could say return list 2. All right, because remember what return does, it'll be the value of this function, right? So then I could say new list is equal to whatever the value of create list is, and in this case it'll always be the list 4, 5, 6, and then I could say print new list, and if I ran this, we get 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6. All right, so that also works. If I want to bring a piece of information outside of a function, if I want to bring a local variable's piece of information outside of the function, I can return it. I could put it inside of a global variable outside. So for example, I could add it to the first list that we created. I just need a way to bring that information out from being a local variable into sort of the global space. All right. So that's essentially the difference between a global and a local variable. That's also a bit of a tricky concept to wrap your head around, especially for newer programmers. But just mess with values. All of this is, you could trial and error and you will pick this up very easily. It's not too hard, but for those of you who aren't necessarily trying, to run little bits of code on your own, like, I don't know, maybe it's too much of a hassle for you to open up Python or whatever. But even then, just open up your command prompt and just type Python, and boom, you've got Python right there. So there's that, and yeah, I encourage you to practice these concepts because it's only going to help you get better, right? It'll only get stuck in your brain, and make you better at programming in Python. But that's essentially it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This one felt like a long one. I don't know how long it was actually, but I'm going to guess somewhere around 20-25 minutes. I hope it's not too much longer than that. But anyways, again, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. And, you know, I'll try better next time. Again, I did mention this in my past videos. Excuse me. I have a Discord server that I will leave an invite to in the link down below. If you have any confusions or just want to come in and say hi, what's up, I don't know, talk with the community, just join and, you know, hang out there, ask questions, doesn't matter. Even if you know Python, you may as well come by and maybe help us teach people. Doesn't really matter. Leave a comment for videos you want to see in the future. I am going to get around to creating more videos for my discord.py series. For those of you who are interested in that still, I'm just trying to wrap up this series really quickly. I've only got a couple more topics left, and then we'll see what happens from there. But that's it for this video. Yeah, bye.